You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. On this episode, we have a very unique interview with Liz Bennett, a literal lawmaker. She is a current member of the Iowa State House of Representatives. And being that this is a goth talk podcast, she is no stranger to the goth and alternative community. Not that long ago, though it may feel like it, I had many friends in the goth community that rode hard for Andrew Yang when it came out that he had been a punk or a goth in high school. Likewise, a lot of goths that I am personal friends with supported Bernie Sanders and were quite chuffed to see his old interview with mall goths. But beyond the overtly political involvement that I've experienced in the goth community, we've argued on this show that politics is more than simply making laws and enforcing them, but in fact, any act within the public domain is in itself political. But before we explore that specifically, we're going to have a little chat with Liz and talk about her life, her experiences, how sexuality, gender, physical presentation can be related and interwoven with being goth, and how that led her into running for office. And if you stick around post-interview, Trey, my co-host, and I are going to have a lengthy discussion about the philosophy of self and how the ways that we understand our self-identity, ourselves as a being, an agent in the world, relates directly to politics and the goth scene specifically. While this does come out in the episode, for the sake of clarity at the beginning, I just want to mention that Liz herself does not identify as a goth. However, as you'll soon find out, she's had a long-term interest in the music, fashion, community, and literature of goth culture. So we have a lot to cover. I think we should just get into it. As always, I am the Count. I'm here with my co-host, Trey. And Liz, thank you so much for being here and taking some time out for us. I would love to start by hearing about when you first became aware of alt culture and goth culture.
Gotcha. I love this question. So I think the entire alt culture, or the idea of alt culture, is something I became aware of gradually during the mid 90s, particularly when Nine Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson hit MTV, which I was only able to very secretly watch in my conservative Catholic home. My parents actually later just had MTV completely blocked out, so I had to smuggle in VHS tapes of like Alternative Nation in 120 minutes.
Wow. Yeah.
But prior to that, I very distinctly remember seeing the video for Shakespeare's Sisters Stay,
Okay.
which, as I was preparing for this interview, I see has been covered by Blute Angle and Cradle of Filth. So I guess others,
Really? I didn't know that.
yeah. So I think other people who are darkly inclined have taken notice of this as well. I was in about fifth grade, and the video just made me feel a certain sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
So Siobhan Fahey's aesthetic, it was like this like brilliant, gorgeous version of Ursula from The Little Mermaid. Like when I played house growing up, like I always wanted to be like the evil queen and stuff like that. So
Yeah, of
it
course.
really resonated with me.
Yeah.
Later on, returning back to Marilyn Manson and Nine Inch Nails, countered these bands in junior high. And they seem to be expressing a lot of the doubt, confusion, and anger that I felt over some of the Catholic doctrine that I was being taught. When you think about it, if you're a person who really does think about the things that you're taught, it's a very heavy burden to be, like 10 or 11 years old and thinking of the people around you going to hell.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. God.
Um,
I was not to interrupt you, but I had a very similar upbringing, and there was a lot of just absolute terror around waking up and my family being gone, and they were raptured or something, or my best friends at school burning in hell forever. That was a real hard thing to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Side note on that, recently this past session in the legislature, it I think it was some kind of conservative day on the Hill, which everybody is welcome. The
Mm-hmm.
people's house is the people's house. But I ended up being in the elevator with some of the folks, and I think they had gotten lost from some of their friends, and they were remarking on that. And so then one of them said, oh, maybe it's the rapture. And then I kind of looked around and I was like, I don't think that's good for you then.
Yeah.
But so anyway, it's like, I'm in this Catholic school. I'm taking it very seriously, maybe more seriously than some of the other kids. Alongside of that, what I now understand is that I was really struggling with a lot of these confines of how girls are raised with regards to gender. So these bands and their aesthetic really represented the opposite of what I was being raised to be as, a nice young lady. And it was just incredibly thrilling to me.
Yeah. Man. So going on from there then, did you have access to any kind of community to get involved and go to shows or go to club events or that kind of thing?
Yes. And I think this is probably somewhat different, than somebody who would have grown up in like New York or big metropolitan area. But I started becoming more expressly interested in the idea of goth around 1996 or 1997. And that was before the internet as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
I was in this Catholic school with a graduating class of 18 people total.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So, luckily my parents were early adopters of having a computer in the home. And my dad had a friend who taught me to use dial-up internet, in my modem terminal to call into BBS services. So I started making some friends who were interested in music that was outside of my experience. At that time, you could only oh my God, you waited like 2 hours for like a 15-second snippet of something.
Uh-huh.
But, it was very exciting still. So as time went on, I was finishing my freshman year in high school, and just all of this, just the whole situation, I was feeling very repressed. I was feeling really unsettled, which, again, I can now name as struggling with gender and sexual orientation. So all of these things and seeing these things in culture fueled my desire to express myself in a way contrary to the mainstream. So at that point, I cut my hair. I experienced being called a dyke for the first time. And after that, I intentionally embraced wearing black. I got this very 90s asymmetrical haircut. I dyed it deep red. And I ended up finding an alternative teen club called Off Limits.
Okay.
That, as I think of it, really could only have existed before cell phones and social media, to be honest. But they had alternative nights on Fridays. And to tell the truth, it was a lifeline for me. It was this place where I felt comfortable. I became more confident. I met people from different backgrounds. I made friends who are openly LGBTQ. Boys were wearing dresses, which was extremely exciting.
Yeah.
And so the format is interesting because it was a sampling kind of all of the different alternative-y subcultures at the time. So like we would have kind of like alternative electronic music, metal, some of which maybe wouldn't have been what you would have heard on the radio or MTV, club music, and a lot of stuff that we would consider goth, like Susie and the Banshees. So huge outpourings of teen angst, lots of Nitzer Ebb, My Life with a Thrill Kill Cult, Lords of Acid, Ministry.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
So the other thing about growing up, kind of in the Midwest before the era of like YouTube and the internet, was that you kind of had to go to the mall and go to the CD store and
Hmm.
dig through and see what album
Hmm.
cover looked cool, and then you could
Yeah.
sample it, or like digging through CDs at Disco Round. My best friend worked at Disco Round, and she was like, we got this CD and I really think you should listen to it. And I was like, "Oh, why?" And she's like, I think you should just listen to it." I was like, "Okay." So I popped it in, and what it was The Last Dance's Fairy Tales album.
Oh, yes, I remember that album.
And
Yeah.
it opens up with that huge organ sound,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love
you
that.
know.
Yeah.
And so you're like, "Oh my god, yes." But and
So
here's
dark.
something. I know, it's so great. But here's something that I think is uniquely Midwestern. I first heard Wampscut on a 4-H girls trip to to the Mall of America, which was like, I mean, it froze me in my spot. I was like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
You
Oh,
know,
yeah.
and I later bought Embryo Dead and Born Again in Germany.
Oh, those are such good albums. Oh, man.
Yeah, just classic. And
Yeah.
so, okay, here's some more fun Midwestern stuff. But
Hmm.
okay, so I had this conversion experience at the Cornerstone Festival.
What year was that? Do you know?
It was 99.
Okay, that was before I went. Okay.
And so the lineup that year, or yeah, it was 99. So like the lineup that year was Wedding Party, Eva
Yeah.
O, and Tara Van
Oh,
Flower.
that's right. Eva O played. I totally forgot about that.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yes.
I have friends who were there when she played. Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, and some of my just like keepsakes, of over time, I still have the Cornerstone magazine article where they interviewed Eva O about her conversion.
That's
Um,
amazing.
yeah. So it was just, I now I think understand what was going on a little differently. You can imagine that this was an extremely intense experience that was followed up by a huge thunderstorm.
Mm,
So of course this felt like this total spiritual experience to
yeah.
me. So but after that I found XNet Goth, the goth message group for Christian goths. And that was cool because again, you really couldn't just like go on YouTube to find music. So as with anything, there were gatekeepers in that group. But there were also people like the incomparable Anderson Marr from Boston, who was just this very kind person who coached baby bats like me on goth rock history. She sent out these incredible mixtapes on one occasion. And then the highlight of my young life at that time, when I was 18, I was old enough to go to Chicago for Nocturna.
Yes.
And it was just like
Yes.
thrilling.
I think that's the best 18 sort of trek to go to Nocturna for the Midwest.
Mhm.
I think that's like a staple for a lot of people. That's so wild. I think I just missed your kind of involvement in that circle of the Christian goth stuff by a few years, and I kind of
Mhm.
came on after that when they were still riding on the vapor waves of what was going on, and I got involved in that community. Unfortunately, I'm not friends with many of those people now because there was still a pretty large bent of Christian evangelicalism, and some of the people I know from back then are still Trump supporters and things like that,
Mhm.
and it's just like we just at this point in my life have nothing in common with each other. But that's wild. I would love to see a clip or a photo of that Eva O interview if you ever dig it up.
Mhm.
That's hilarious.
I'll see if I can find it. But yeah, I mean it was just a total trip.
Yeah.
So, and that's actually how I found Cemetery Confessions. Was I cannot remember if I was just maybe kind of like looking for goth podcasts, or if I was like, I wonder what's going on in that world. Maybe did a
Hmm.
search for like Christian goth, but I found the Cemetery Confessions episode on Christian goth, and you had my
Yeah.
friend Chris on, and just like, oh
Yeah.
my god, everything that was being said, I was like, oh my god,
Yeah.
like I lived that.
I think I'm still decompressing from those few years of my life. So crazy. So crazy. What a weird. And every time I talk to goths that had no experience with that, they're always fascinated by this weird, mysterious cult of Christian goths that had their own
Mm.
bands and had their own get-togethers and their own concerts and stuff. And it's just always so strange and fascinating to them.
It's a trip, and I think, like, maybe you've experienced this, but one of the funniest things about that conversation, is at the time, and maybe still now, people think that there's this quandary about, like, Christian goth.
Hmm.
I disagree. I don't think there is anything more gothic than, like, people who actually think that it is their responsibility to make sure that everyone around them does not go to hell, and not just kind of hell, like actual real hell.
Mm.
Like the intensity of that emotion and the
Mm.
bigness of that, I think is it totally fits
The
in, I guess, with the
passion. Yeah.
intensity of goth culture to me. I don't know.
Yeah. I do think that's it's such a heavy burden, but I feel like if you actually believe those things, you do kind of have that incentive that you need to do that. Um, all right, let's not. I'm going to start reliving my trauma of my childhood here in a second.
Right, yeah, let's go somewhere else.
Cool. So, well, then let's. I assume these two things are intertwined to some degree or the other, but I wanted to then go to ask about when you started getting interested in politics and wanting to take the route of becoming an elected official or just getting involved.
Yeah, so that for me, I guess, is sometimes a long and rambling story, especially when you consider, for me, I do believe that the personal is political.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a time for me when I was interested in politics, but would not have called it politics.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a point where I actually got into what we would consider like more formal electoral politics. So,
Mm-hmm.
as a side note, politics was a constant in my home growing up. My mother is a conservative activist,
Mm.
and actually boycotted my swearing into the Iowa House.
Oh, wow.
As a kind of a fun plug into our topic of our goth subject matter. I remember this one time when I was about 15, and my mom had picked me up, from off limits, and I'm wearing like knee high boots and ripped fishnets and like spike collar and stuff like that, and she
Mm-hmm.
was responsible for picking up like the big campaign signs for this conservative politician. And it's cold, and so like we stop at this intersection, and she's like, get out, get that sign. And I'm like, what if they think I'm stealing it? And she's like, they won't think you're stealing it. And I'm like, look at me, they might think I'm stealing it. Anyway, whatever. I survived that. But, I mean, very much like in our home, this was the time of the Christian Coalition. I remember like, people like talking about making laws to like ban 9 Inch Nails.
Mm.
I mean, by the time I was 14, I had been called a dyke. I really got into feminism while I was in high school. And at the public library, I was able to read publications like The Advocate,
Mm.
and Ms. Magazine, and there's a like now defunct publication called Off Our Back. So I just really started thinking about a lot of that stuff. I started listening to other music like Ani DeFranco, and Tori
Mm-hmm.
Amos. And so my best friend and I, our senior year in high school were, very known as feminists. So, to be honest, I don't think there's anybody who is actually surprised when I started getting into more formal politics. So my more formal involvement came when I was at community college. I had a professor, and think I was lamenting something or another during office hours, and she's wonderful. You have to imagine Mrs. Frizzle,
Okay.
like Mrs. Frizzle, who teaches like social psychology and human
Mm-hmm.
sexuality,
Mm. I can see it.
and yeah, it's so great. Like, and so anyway, so she just like vibrated with anger, and she was like, "You listen." Young women like you need to get into the room where decisions are being made, because if you do not, other people will make these decisions for you,
Mm.
and you will not like it. So I was like, oh, okay. Like Mrs. Frizzle is yelling at me. um, but I took that to heart, and my next question was like, well, I mean, there's so much to know about all of these issues. If you're an intelligent person, you really think of things from different perspectives, and there's so much information. And so the advice that she gave me was, look, there are probably 4 or 5 issues that you really care about that impact you. You are more than capable of reading the newspaper and finding out what these candidates think about these particular issues, and you can start there. So I was like, okay. So the first time I was like, okay, you know what? Like, I'm going to get off the fence and actually do something, despite having voted prior to that, was 07, 08, for the Obama campaign. I was a college student. I was a server. And just really took my time with the candidates, and I was really inspired by Barack Obama, and really had these conversations, and a lot of my coworkers were as well. So we figured out and kind of like lobbied for about 7 of us to be able to make sure to get the night off for the Iowa caucuses. And then we met up at work later for drinks. And so for us, seeing Barack Obama win the Iowa caucuses, and feeling like we had a part in that was really powerful. The other thing I think that was really powerful for me was, so at the time, I commuted to school. I was going to Cornell College by that time, I think, or no, I was still at community college, and like I was living in kind of a more conservative area of the metro area. So what was really powerful about that experience is that you go to this gym, and out of the woodwork, here are all of these people, who at least believe in most of the things that you believe in. So it was a really powerful feeling. So,
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of kind of stories out there in the media of people who were like super volunteers for Obama and then like became political directors and all this stuff. That wasn't me. I was a working college student. I was exhausted. But I was able to volunteer a little bit, and that was, a step in that direction for me. Later on, when I was attending Cornell College in Iowa, it's a small liberal arts college. I was taking this course focusing on race, sex, and the Constitution. So we were really digging deep on things like equal protection, and something that wasn't even on my radar, marriage equality. All of a sudden, the Iowa Supreme Court is like, bam, and releases this marriage equality decision for the state of Iowa. So it was like, oh my God, and at that time I was in a long-term committed relationship with a woman. So like all of a sudden when you're like, oh, whoa, okay, like we could do these things. So it was really changing for me. And so I just felt this urgency because immediately when that happened, I mean, to give you an idea of what this looked like, this was 09 in Iowa. Before the decision was released, like state police were stationed at the Iowa Supreme Court in case there was some kind of violence or riot or something.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, so just like for me, the sense of urgency, because immediately there was a backlash. There was a really strong push, not just to recall those judges, but also to actually add discrimination to the Iowa Constitution.
Wow.
And I was just like, no, like I can't.
Yeah.
Like this aggression will not stand, man. So I just got super involved with calling and emailing my legislators. One day during class, my state senator actually called me, which blew me away. Which is kind of like an Iowa thing, I think, in particular. But I just got super involved on campus. Like I was writing for the campus newspaper. I was organizing. I canvassed in rural Iowa that summer for marriage equality. Members of my family from elsewhere were like, oh my God, like you're going to get killed.
Wow.
And stuff.
Wow.
But, like we made it through. The next year I organized about 19 students, out of a campus of about 1,000 or 1,100 people, and raised the money for us to attend the National Equality March. in Washington, D.C. So that was really important to me. And then like a real turning point for me was having gone through my school's pre-law program, really thinking about what I want my life, like what I wanted my life to look like and what was important to me and what I wanted to accomplish and what I was good at. I'm really good at organizing people, you know? I've always been kind of like an includer or like a person who's like, "Oh, like let's do this together," or like, "Let's go
Mm,
do this thing." Which you can imagine is can create kind of a funny scene. I went to
mm.
this we had like one LGBTQ like youth group that was independent of any schools in the Quad Cities when I was growing up. And so this day I like walk in the door and here's my friend or somebody who later became my friend named Noel, and he's like wearing a cape and has like lipstick and like like winkle pickers on and like
Perfect.
vinyl pants and like a Wumps cut shirt. So I'm like, oh my God, yes. So I like walk over him and I'm like, oh my God, I love your shirt. And he's like, like, who is this person?
Uh-huh.
But like that just is how I am. Like I'm very excited about things. And so just like after organizing that year, I qualified for a fellowship from my school. And so I did this internship with One Iowa, which is an LGBTQ rights organization. Then I was hired by that organization through 2011, where we defeated the last credible push against marriage equality in the state.
Fantastic.
So yeah, I mean, it was incredible. And all the while, now moving on to even more involvement in politics, all the while I'm doing this, like I'm this girl with this red like mohawk,
Mm.
um, stomping around in chucks and weird shirts. But like it allowed me to build a huge network of people. So I was recruited to my county central committee, which was really cool. So that was kind of another step into formal involvements. I'd been really involved with Stonewall Democrats.
Hmm.
And I was first approached to run for office in 2010, honestly, as a sacrificial lamb.
Oh, yeah. Mm.
Which, now, granted, so when I say sacrificial lamb, there are certain districts that progressively need people, like just the numbers. It is going to be really, really difficult for you to win there.
Right.
And either who you have to be or what you have to do to win is to really take stances on issues that are just a bit conservative leaning.
Mm.
That's not possible for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so luckily I had some really good advisors who were like, well, one thing you can do is you can use something like this to get your message out. Like that's a worthy thing to
Hmm.
do. So let's return to that later when we talk about how people can get involved more. You can also use a campaign like that to demonstrate to other people that you are capable and that even in a difficult situation, you can organize and run the best campaign possible, even if you don't win.
Right.
But just for me, it wasn't the right time. Now, 2013 came along. I had moved into a different district intentionally, that was very, very progressive, like lots of environmentalists, pro-choice, feminist people, stuff like that. And my state representative launched a run for governor. So some people came to me and, and said, sorry, my dog is like, I don't know what she's doing right
It's
now.
fine. It's fine.
What are you doing? But, so some people came to me at that point and was like, now is the time you do this. You can honestly represent this district as yourself.
Mm.
And you should run. And so, like I just took a second to think about it. I had to talk to my job and stuff like that. And I was like, yes, I'm doing this. I'm all in. And so I had a long campaign. My first campaign was 18 months long. I had been running for 5 months when another candidate was recruited to run against me
Mm-hmm.
by somebody who basically could not get the support to run herself.
Mm.
And the individual who was recruited was a good person, so nothing against that individual. He's a good person. that was really emotionally difficult because, I'd been extremely organized, really demonstrating that like I am in this to win this.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened at that point is that when you get into a primary situation, um, kind of the real stuff starts to come out, right?
Mm.
So people who you thought were on the same page with you can really shock you.
Mm.
So at one point, somebody who was very helpful approached me when we had to sit down and said, "Okay, I think you need to know about this so you can decide how to deal with this." A few people have said to me, "Liz Bennett, isn't she that girl who was dating a girl for like a long time and now she is dating a man?"
Oh boy.
And
Yeah.
honestly, it shocked me. I did not expect that.
Yeah.
And what also surprised me about it is just like the shock of fear it sent down through my belly.
Mm.
Because having somebody call you a dyke is one thing. Having people who are part of a community that you've been a part of for a long time,
Yeah.
really kind of imply that like you're not really part of that community.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. So there was that. Kind of the other thing that reached my ear. So when I ran, I was a trainer for a technology company and was really interested in clean energy. I was interested in STEAM education,
Mm.
workforce, stuff like that. I had graduated from college in the middle of a recession, as did many of my friends. So those were kind of the big things that, I was worried about. It's a given. Like, I'm always going to be standing up for reproductive rights. Like, I'm always going to be standing up for LGBTQ rights. So, that was something
Yeah.
that was like, duh. So it wasn't something I needed to print on any of my materials or whatever. But people in marginalized groups of different types frequently find out that you are reduced to one aspect of your identity.
Yeah.
So whether it's being the candidate of color,
Yeah.
or the gay,
Yeah.
you are expected to prove that you're not just the gay.
Yeah.
And I mean, so it reached my ears that my opponent's supporters were saying like, she doesn't know anything. She just knows about the gay stuff. And I'm like, like, I have news for you. Like, I'm training for a major tech company that is giving people jobs, some of whom are making like actually really good money for the first time in their lives. So I think you
Mm.
can sit down. And then the other really interesting thing that happened, which could hold a, I don't know, like a lesson or a takeaway for other people, was so by this time, kind of like grown my hair out. I went through just like a devastating breakup in
Mm.
2012.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm willing to talk about this openly. I'm a person who has dealt with depression probably for my entire life. And something like a breakup can just really throw you into a spiral.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once you're like really dealing with things really well, the idea, especially if you are kind of a type A person, of getting into that situation where you are really depressed again is terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, to the point where like I like couldn't listen to The Cure.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Oh, like
Yeah.
there's this feeling where you're like, oh no,
Yeah.
like I can't do this right now.
Yeah.
But so anyway, long story short, I'm like getting over this breakup, and my hairstylist is like, well, like maybe you should perk up a little, like maybe we should do a few highlights or something. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So that's the story of how I became a blonde.
Beautiful.
But anyway, so on that, hey, let's have some good old sexism to go with some biphobia.
Mm-hmm.
My opponent's team was telling people she just thinks that she can be blonde and put glamour shots on Facebook.
Oh my
And
God.
she doesn't know anything. So what's really interesting though, so of course that's offensive. And honestly, like when people who, again, like you thought you were on the same side, when you hear that coming from them, you're
Yeah.
just like, oh my God. I during my campaign, I was like, you know what? Maybe one day I will write a book called Does Hillary Cry?
It's a great title.
Because yeah, I think so too. Because like some of those things are just like a gut punch, you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, I think that maybe this could be something that's helpful to anybody maybe dealing with anything, like whether it's sexism or maybe you're a subculture person, and you're running for one of these offices and people are saying like, oh my God, no. You can outwork them.
Mm.
Frequently, you can outwork them. And so I think I still would have beaten my opponent because, frankly, I was organized. I had former Obama staffers working with my data for me.
Mm.
I was working myself. I was still working full time during my entire campaign. And then, like, I would go home from working my tech job, and like put on the whole thing. Like, I had this uniform that I would wear to knock on people's doors, and like put on my candidate hair, is what I would call it, which means basically not looking like you're exhausted. Um,
Right.
anyway, I'm kind of rambling on this, but the point here is that all the while that I was organizing, involving people in my campaign, um, knocking doors with a foot injury, like doing all this stuff, my opponent's team was just telling everybody, like, oh, like she doesn't know anything. She's not going to win. Well, when you tell people that, does that really inspire them to get out and work for you?
No.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So their team ended up experiencing a humiliating defeat at my hands.
Fantastic.
I did win by about 63%.
Wow.
Right. And so, so what we're talking
Yeah.
about, like, we are talking about a newcomer, queer, young,
Yeah.
blonde woman defeating a sitting school board member who was a teacher in that community for 50 years.
Badass.
So, yeah, I think that can be a takeaway for maybe anybody facing some adversity, that people will underestimate you, but not doing work doesn't get votes. So go out and get it.
It is. I do think it is unfortunate that the marginalized communities do have to work harder. It's fantastic that you did overcome, but oftentimes it does seem like people can just sort of rest on stoking bigotry and stereotypes and rest in that, while people that are actually being oppressed have to work twice as hard to get half as far, kind of thing.
Absolutely. If I can on that, let me take a second to absolutely acknowledge privilege. Because although there was some garbage I had to deal with, I did have the privilege of presenting as a white woman who wasn't necessarily visibly queer.
Right. Right.
And so the reality is that there is garbage that other people are going through that I can't even comprehend. And that's why it's even more important, hopefully, for the people who listen to your podcast, to go out and get behind these people, donate to them, make phone calls for them, text them, because our country would be better if people making decisions were actually representative of the population of the United States.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's move. Let's kind of blend those two together then, as far as your experience in alternative culture and goth culture and getting into politics, because this has been a recurring question on the show of, in what ways does goth have the potential to be politically relevant, and do those two things cross over? And so I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on that and how that worked for you.
For me, I think it's a little different because at that point, I was not, like, if you looked at a picture of me, you wouldn't peg me, as goth.
Right.
And to be clear, I don't exactly identify as like a goth,
Right.
like
Right.
a capital goth. I diminutively refer to myself as kind of a goth kid. Certainly, if the Inquisition came calling, there would be enough to make a very interesting political ad. We could say that.
Right. Sure. Okay.
But I mean, so yeah, I mean, so that is the thing that has to be acknowledged, and that wasn't necessarily on purpose. One thing I will tell you is that once you get into the public eye, you do enjoy having something that is just for you.
Mm.
So, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's a little subversive as well. Maybe it feels good to be like, oh yes, hello, I'm your friendly neighborhood blonde,
Right.
like
Right.
let's go listen to the Sisters of Mercy now. So, regarding goth being politically relevant, yes, I sometimes think that goths may be particularly equipped for this moment. Though again, the discomfort that a person feels being called names, or singled out is not the same usually as the discomfort that a person feels in fearing for their life
Right.
because of their
Absolutely.
immutable characteristics.
Yeah.
Yep.
However, I think that you can start with that willingness to say, no, this is what I am doing, and move further. If you are not a person of color, for example, I think that you can start there and say, like, I am going to go out and do even more truly uncomfortable things to be an ally, to be an accomplice, to stand between the police and
Mm-hmm.
people who are being systemically harmed. So I think that's a start. Maybe in some ways, I can't remember the name of this book, but it caught my eye several years ago. It was about the power of worst case thinkers in organizations.
Okay.
If you are someone who tends to think of the worst case scenario, which not to be stereotypical, but perhaps some of your listeners
Mm-hmm.
may have some of those qualities, that is needed in organizations.
Mm.
It's needed in nonprofits. It's needed in political organizations. So perhaps that is a way, um, where a group of people who may have some of these characteristics, can really, really engage with social movements and be of use.
Mm.
I guess particularly on the front of gender, but also like when thinking about economic systems. My experience with people who have been interested in Gothic subculture is that many people are interested in exploring ways of being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, like, culture will always need people to be at the vanguard.
Mm.
And I think that's plentiful, in goth culture. And then I think the other place that goth can be really politically relevant, honestly, things are really bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Crushingly bad. And so people process these things different ways. I think that there are people who really do need to sit with that, and they need a place to process that without what some
Mm.
people are now calling toxic positivity.
Yeah.
I think that, and I have experienced, the culture this way over the years, just having a couple hours to be with that and release that, and then walk out, probably take some aspirin and drink some Gatorade.
Yeah.
But like walk out and then like get back at it.
Mm.
I think that that's something that's really powerful. There's a podcast that I listen to sometimes called Mindfulness of Doom.
Okay.
Okay.
It's really cute. Like their opening thing, like they call their podcast like Mindfulness of Doom. It's very Invader Zim.
Uh.
But they're very stoic. But I think that to process the immensity of things like the climate crisis
Mm.
and systemic racism and compulsory heterosexuality,
Mm-hmm.
I think it is really useful to sit for a while and say, okay, these things are horrible and crushing, and horrible things are happening, and horrible things are going to happen. So now that
Yeah.
I have acknowledged that, now I can move on and decide what to do with it.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something that the goth scene can offer.
That's a fantastic point. I think, I think that was really cathartic for me when I was younger, especially, but not necessarily something I'd thought of recently, but I think that's a really insightful point. If you don't mind me taking a couple minutes, I did want to share some of my thoughts on this question.
I was going to say before you go ahead and do
Yeah.
that, I guess one comment I wanted to make just around that whole discussion there is, I think people need to stop viewing, I guess, oppression as a competition. Like, I've been oppressed worse than you, and this is oftentimes more from the perspective of privilege, where, oh, I can't feel your pain because I'm too busy being whatever it is. I'm poor, or, you know, I've been picked on because I'm goth, or, you know, I've been stopped by police too. And it's not about whether you or they had it better. It's an experience and a practice in empathy. It's taking that experience that you had, whether it's greater or lesser than the other person's experience with whatever. If you've had an experience of being oppressed, being judged by your appearance, being judged by, you know, arbitrary factors of your being, not by the content of your character, use that as a way to grow and understand that other people have these experiences too, whether greater or lesser, but then use that as empathy. How you felt, reflect that on how their life is as well. And don't get too caught up in, well, I was also this, and well, I had also been that, and look at, I'm doing just fine. Need to be able to reflect that and think about it in that way.
A friend of mine who's a political science major, he had this sort of intuition pump very similar to that when he was talking with conservative relatives about where they would bring up this idea of privilege and say, you know, well, I was poor and I had this problem and I had that problem. And he would say, okay, so imagine everything about your life is the same, but now you're also a black woman. How much worse do you think that situation would be? And I think instilling that empathy is really important.
Thanks for hopping in on that, Trey.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate that you brought that up, because I think that now is a time for solidarity. I think now is a time for yes and.
Yeah.
Now is the time to say, okay, I experienced this thing, and Daniel, like what you said, I experienced this thing, and if other people are experiencing this times 100 or times 1,000, that is bullshit.
Yeah.
And I am going to take your hand, and we are going to say no more to this altogether.
Right. Yeah. It's powerful. That's really powerful. My general thoughts on this, because I, in the past, argued for the idea that goth should be apolitical, and this idea of privilege is going to come up again here when I was reflecting on why I made those arguments. And a lot of that had to do with having the privilege of being able to separate concepts, where I could partition culture from community, from politics, in a sort of intellectual way, and feel like they could be understood as separate entities. But the problem is that's not how lived experience unfolds in all of its complexity, right? You have trans people, people of color, and other minorities. They don't get the luxury of separating their identity and their life experiences from politics, because broader culture in many ways is denying them access to those things, their agency, their validity. And so for them, advocating simply to coexist is a political statement, because there's such a history of economic, sociocultural oppression for marginalized groups. And I think part of the problem, at least for me, and a lot of people I talk to, I think, is that we project our own experiences onto the world. And so when you're white, middle class, if you're straight, if you're a cis male, the culture that we live in projects back to you that perspective is morally and culturally normative, and reinforces that ignorance and that privilege of what people that aren't like that go through.
I think even beyond that, I think it also postulates that it's not just normative, but superior in a lot of cases. And that's makes it even more egregious.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so So goth, in many ways, you're talking about different ways of being. It can help to normalize different ways of being in the world. I think if we act as if goth has nothing to say about politics, we pretend that we can wall ourselves off from the rest of the world. And what that means is we aren't actively pushing to change those sociopolitical structures that have and still do conduct harm to minorities. And the thing is, those same minorities are also part of our community. So if we're showing that we are okay with the status quo and we're not going to do anything, we are furthering that marginalization. Which is why I said in a previous show, there's no neutral, passive way of being goth. You're always making a political statement, whether you acknowledge that or not. And actually that, and something you brought up earlier reminded me, I just watched the Netflix documentary, The 13th, and they talk about how, somebody in there talks about how Republicans are pushing now for justice reform, even though they historically have pushed for laws that do things like over police black communities and destroy black families and that kind of thing. And they were making the argument that if you let those same people become the voice of justice reform, then you know that we're not going to admit the wrongdoing in the past, and the changes that we make will probably be surface level and lead to oppression in other ways. So there's that danger of rejecting a connection to a political statement is allowing others to have that voice, which is kind of related to that slogan, like white silence is white violence, because there is trauma being inflicted on people of color. And if we're going to say that goth is just about going dancing to music on the weekends, we're complicit in that trauma by pretending it's not our job to do anything about it. And I don't want to say too much about this. I'll link to an article from LA Weekly because I don't want to get too much into drama, but I think this is what we see happening in a lot of places, but specifically there's this LA Club Cloak and Dagger that's going through this upheaval because people were trying to remain neutral, which leads to behavior that harms, sexist behavior, transphobic behavior, racist behavior that gets covered up and ignored by the people leading the scene. And then that just builds up over time and eventually collapses that community because we thought we could just pretend we don't have anything to say about it. So I think honestly, you're either causing harm or you're part of the solution, is the way I look at it. So, all right, let's move on then. All right, well, let me ask this question then, and then we can see about wrapping it up. Because you brought this up, and I wanted to get your opinion on it. Maybe you've talked about this a bit already, but this sort of understanding the self. I'm always really interested in understanding the self, whether it's from a gender perspective, how we decide to present ourselves to others, the psychology behind how we conceptualize the self. That's really interesting to me. From the outside, when I look at the government, though, it appears to be very homogenous. There's a lot of formal wear, no tattoos or piercings. There's almost no trans people. It's only very recently that we're starting to see more women and people of color in government. So it's difficult from the outside. I kind of know that these are people that have interests, just like you and I are having a conversation, and you're a very diverse, robust person. But the way that the government is presented is as their entire identity is, making things into law and talking about politics, and that's it. And that's their entire life. So I guess what I wanted to ask was, what was your experience like entering that environment? And then how do you balance having a personal life with a public persona?
I think the key word is balance.
Hmm.
And that is something that I am still navigating. It's something I'm still navigating.
Yeah.
I think that not unreasonably, especially when I first ran, and in my first year, I was really scared of a lot of things. The difficulty of politics is that people are really busy. So you do have to make yourself easy to understand. Like people do need to feel that like they understand you, that they identify with you, that they understand where you're coming from. and understand what your values are. And that's what gets you through some of the times where maybe the policy stance you have taken isn't exactly what somebody else would have taken, but they trust you because they get you, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the signals that you are sending, they are able to interpret. So as a woman, as a young person, as a queer person, especially at the beginning, there was like this question of like, okay, how can I make sure that people understand me? But also, how can I do that authentically? Again, acknowledging privilege, have been able to do this, I think, in some different ways that other people may not have gotten away with, to be honest. My hope, though, is that because I have done some of these things, that when other people go to do them, um, that people are happy
Mm.
to call out and say, well, how come Liz Bennett gets to do this?
Right.
I'm totally fine with that. Call it out, because the things that I have done, other people should be able to do as well. But beyond that, some of my kind of more outward self-expression, again, like that's privilege, because there are women of color out there who are just trying to have their natural hair
Yeah.
and
God.
not be discriminated against, which
Yeah.
is like, oh my
Yeah.
god.
Yeah.
But so I mean, some of the things that were important to me, once I felt that I did build some political capital and that people in the community understood me more, even than when I got elected, there was kind of that moment where you're like, okay, like I've done all the right things, but that internal chafing.
Mm.
Um, so at the end of my first term, I did kind of like shave the underside of my head, which was an interesting experience, because in every other way, I was presenting as, I would say fairly traditionally.
Mm-hmm.
But people were very worried about it. Well-meaning people, wonderful, well-meaning, very kind person, I think was afraid to say it to me, so said it to one of my fellow representatives, but like this long, very worried thing about like, what is she doing? Like, she's going to ruin her career. She's going to embarrass the other Democrats,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. But for me, it started to be a question of how long can I do this?
Right.
So, because it was incredibly stifling, I
Yeah.
decided that I had a lot more work to do. So I was just going to have to start expressing myself some of the ways that I felt that I needed to, and just keep going. Right. And like
Yeah.
understanding that people would be like, oh my God, what's happening? Right. My second year back, so after 2016, like 2 days after the election, I threw up out the window of my car.
Mm.
Seriously. And
Yeah.
so I like rage cut my hair. By then I was back to, oh no, I hadn't colored my hair purple yet. But so I like went back that year with like basically this like extremely, like this very outwardly queer like flat top.
Fantastic.
And so that was one of those where I think, because it was still a traditional color, I don't think anybody felt comfortable saying anything to me.
Mm.
Or maybe they're just like my parents and they just resign themselves to the fact that like Elizabeth is just going to do what Elizabeth is going to do. In the spring of that year, I think just like the depression as it really set in, what the Trump presidency was going to be like, was really getting to me. And my stylist was like, like why don't we really change this up? Like, it just seems like you're just really feeling like you need to come out a little bit more.
Mm.
Um, so like she gave me this like super traditional, like really classy haircut that we colored lavender. So same thing. Like that one though, like there were people who I care for very much who were like, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" I'm like, "You are humiliating the Democrats."
So wild. Wow.
Side note, somebody coloring their hair is not humiliating the Democrats, but that's a different podcast.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, but like as each thing has kind of gone, it's kind of been like, okay, like we have to let people get used to this. But you know what? By a month or two after that, we were seeing like moms coming to the Capitol with like pink or purple stripes in their hair.
Beautiful.
We're seeing like grandmas at like community meetings, and like now it's very normal to see people working in the Capitol, either wearing more expressive clothes, or more, just more expressive hair. And then the final thing, I mean, those are really surface things. When it really comes down to thinking of like, really, like, who are you? Like, why are you doing this? What that really comes down to is deciding what political stands I'm going to take, like what battles I'm going to fight. So for me, that meant, in 2014, when I was newly elected, like being the only person to show up and say Black Lives Matter,
Yeah.
like being the person to show up when a Black man is shot by a police officer in our community, and saying Black Lives Matter. Stuff like that, because like, that other stuff, like that's, for me at least, like it's important to me to express myself that way, but what's really important to me is showing up.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to keep my comments to myself, I think, so we can wrap up here. I think maybe if you have time, we can end by talking about music, because when I was thinking about this discussion, I wanted to ask about how music has remained relevant for you over the years as you've developed as a person, and how that's matured in meaningful ways for you. But before I could even mention that, you came up with this incredible idea to share some songs that have resonated and supported you over various parts of your life. So I don't know if you still have those, if your notes are gone, but if you wanted to go through some of those, I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, we can just talk about it a little bit.
Sure.
Particularly my early and mid 20s were extremely difficult for me. Just dealing with sexual orientation, gender, dealing with religious abuse, and kind of coming out of that stuff. The Crew Shadow's entire Wishfire album, particularly Return, Coming Home, Tears, which isn't there like, as I recall, isn't there like a super awesome like a Pop Stigma Berserk remix of that? I think there is. I don't know, but or maybe it's like B&B Vision or something.
Maybe they did a lot of remixes. So
yeah, but it's an awesome remix. Okay, Spectators from that album is, I think, a good meditation for a lot of different life situations. And also the song Resist, like Resistor with an R, is, again, I think, extremely relevant for people in the scene thinking about what they are going to do at this time in history and how their involvement in the goth scene relates to that. Thou Shalt Not, the entire album, The White Beyond, just the whole album. I was trying to figure out what I was doing with my life, and I was driving around the Rocky Mountain, like listening to that album, crying. Circa 2007. Also, Peter Murphy's Cascade album was life-changing for me. The song Gliding Like a Whale has consistently provided a mantra for me since I was 18 or 19. And then Susie and the Banshees Superstition album is an album for feeling good for me.
Yeah.
And then like Disintegration, because Disintegration.
Yeah. Yep. Has to be. Oh man, Liz, thank you so much. Thank you so much for hanging out. This was Oh, it's such a pleasure to listen to you share your story and everything. Did you want to, I don't know how much time you have. Did you want to, I was going to ask about some advice for people who want to become active in politics, what they can do, if they're starting to see now, especially that the protests and the social discourse has started to change. Um, did you want to share some advice for how small ways we can start getting involved and making a difference?
Yes, that is my life mission. So, okay. I think that there are a lot of different ways of getting involved, and the way that I see this is that all of these different ways are necessary and work together, okay?
Hmm.
So, if you are somebody where you decide I want to get in the room, I want to get in the room, okay? I want to achieve whatever is possible with the current system that we have, right? If you if you are a person who identifies enough with an established political party, look up what that political party is doing in your area. Join their central committee. If they're not doing a lot, form a club. Some of the bigger cities have these really cool democratic clubs.
Mm.
So that's a thing to do. If you if you feel if you feel that you're really having trouble maybe engaging in that way, um go around roadblocks, start something else, because some, I mean, look, institutions are resistant to change. That doesn't mean that you don't have something really important to do.
Mm.
Look up nonprofits in your area. I'm a believer that if you put your foot on the road and start walking, you will come across the people and the places and the resources that you need to end up where you're going, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
If you're a person, and again, I think this can possibly be a yes and I think you can be part of trying to work from within the system and also take direct action. Maybe you decide that you just cannot engage with the system as is. Get involved that way, particularly on the matter of racial justice. Like, there are some excellent lists out there that you can Google, to start with yourself. Understanding how you can change your behavior to not only not contribute to oppressing others, but to stand in the way of that oppression and take down that oppression. I think there are a lot of different ways. There are some organizations that I really like a lot. Sometimes you might just decide that, like, oh my God, you cannot deal with people, and you want to support other people who are getting in there and doing it. Some organizations that I really appreciate are local politics. You're going to find folks that are more representative, I think, of the population of the US, really reshaping a lot of these institutions and policies. The Young Elected Officials Network is a great network to follow. Again, if you want to follow people who are trans, queer, people of color who are doing this incredible work. So maybe you're not into direct action, maybe you're not into joining a club, but you can find people that you can support and align yourself with to support their work.
Right.
So I think that's a start. This is not comprehensive, but those are a few things.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a lot to go on. I really appreciate that because it is, I think once you get started, you kind of get rolling, but it's getting started is the thing, getting connected to people, right? So,
Yes, and don't get discouraged.
yeah. Thank you so much for your time. This has gone by very quickly, but it was really a pleasure to hang out and speak with you. So, thank you so much for taking the time to come
Yes,
on.
thank you.
Thank you both for inviting me, and thank you for your podcast. I really enjoy it, and it
Oh,
really does give me a place to take a break and touch base with something that has been a comfort to me, over the past 25 years. So
That's so sweet. Thank you. I did have just one piece of advice as far as getting involved, and that which kind of rolls back into the larger point I wanted to make. If you feel overwhelmed about the idea of making extensive cultural change, those are things that you can't change individually. It takes decades, but that big change does start with changing yourself. It's something that I think is very important, is addressing your own internal prejudices, internalized misogyny, that kind of thing, and doing the continual hard work to decolonize yourself is something directly related to bringing about broader political and cultural change. So even just the initial act of educating yourself on these issues, thinking about how you behave and why you behave that way, is a step in the right direction for everybody.
I mean, kind of bouncing off what you were just saying, though, taking it from another tack that I kind of think is something that Liz was almost getting at with the just get on the road and start walking. I think a lot of the issues with people getting into politics or political movements or activism is that they want to do it just right. They don't want to start and make a mess or make mistakes. They want to get in there and be the one that just makes all the change and all of that. And it's this idea that, there's been quotes throughout history, but the one that always sticks with me is that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Mm-hmm. This idea that if you spend so much time waiting for the perfect moment, waiting to craft the perfect statement, waiting to do it just so, that's a great way of, as you were saying with the hard work, it's a great way of putting that off. You're like, oh, no, I want to do the hard work. So I'm a good person because I want to do the hard work, but I've got to do it right. So I got to keep reading and thinking and investigating, but not doing. Whereas you do have to eventually just jump in there and start doing. And if you're so fixated on your actions being perfected before you even start, you're never going to start.
I saw a Twitter thread. I don't know who it was, but they were basically saying that when you are getting into leftist spaces and activism and that kind of thing, you have to go in knowing that as you try and be an activist and a proponent for equality and that kind of stuff, that you are going to hurt other people that are trying to do the same thing through your actions and the things that you say. And it's important that you just have to acknowledge that's going to happen through the growing process. And it's something that you need to address, not get defensive about, and something that you can change and become better at over time. But because we all do have these sort of, internalized behaviors that we have not thought about or critically examined, that's going to come out, and you're going to say things or do things that are hurtful to people. And you'll just have to stop and listen and take that feedback and move on from that. Mm-hmm. The thing I wanted to talk about, going back to the self and the idea of the self, because I think Liz brought up I don't remember what she brought up, but we were talking about, the homogenous culture around politics and her struggle, sharing her struggle of just trying to be expressive in some way.
Right. The dichotomy or the strain of I'm feeling stressed and my release is this expression of individuality, but I'm afraid that will undercut my message, undercut my ability to get things done, undercut my ability to stay in this position to make change. And then the people around her who are helping her, try to maintain that, try to maintain those connections and appearances with the constituency, saying, "Ooh, are you sure you want to do that? That's really damaging. You're gonna, like she said, embarrass the Democrats and stuff like that." There's a lot of conflicting things there. Yeah. But one thing I think she kind of sort of implied, I think, now I probably shouldn't be putting words in her mouth when she can't speak back, but this idea that as you work, you get in there, you're looking approachable and acceptable just so you can get your voice heard. And as you're in there and as you're doing actions and as you're making moves and showing your constituency what your true values are through your actions. And then if you start changing not your actions, but just aspects of your being, appearance, things like that, your demeanor, people can then reflect on that. Whereas initially they would have just assumed all these things about you because all they knew of you is that stereotype around whatever that thing you changed is.
Yeah.
Versus now they have a body of knowledge. Now you've become part of their tribe, their family. And while now you're being a little bit odd and unusual, you're no longer the freak, you're their freak.
Right.
And it's easier to be accepted at that point because that's something that a lot of people deal with. I think a lot of people deal with that within family, especially. And the sort of protective nature of those close communities where a community might be negative to people who are similar outside of their group, but the one that's in their group, they're like, oh, but they're our person too. They may be a little bit weird like those other people, but they're still ours.
Mm-hmm.
And while that's a negative fact that dichotomy of us and them exists, it's not something we can get away from. But I think building that rapport, building that respect, I mean, this is something that I do in my own job too. I mean, whenever I started a new job, this one, any previous ones, you tone everything down right at the beginning, right? Yeah. You get in there and you want your work to speak for itself. You want to have as few aspects to build a stereotype around and let your work speak. But as your work has spoken, and once you have a volume of reputation, once you have that cultural capital, you can start letting some more of your individuality out, and people won't judge you for it as much because they know you more deeply.
Yeah.
And it's harder to judge someone once they've become a person to you.
And that is exactly what I wanted to talk about, that tactic of othering people and stereotyping people in a attempt to dehumanize them and turn them into these abstractions rather than being people. And I think that politics kind of underlies the way that we conflate individual with group identity, especially. So obviously you have groups, Republican, Democrat, whatever, but it seems like the public discourse around politicians has this immutable and persistent quality where you're judged on the way you voted 10 years ago today, and there's less flexibility, there's less room to show personal growth and a change of opinions. And then when that does happen, when people do update their beliefs based on new information, then a lot of times you'll get accosted as being inconsistent and untrustworthy because you're not, because you changed your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is an outcome of the thing I have a bone to pick about a lot of being reductionism, this sort of way of viewing the world based in positivism where everything is mechanistic and sort of human behavior is reduced to these hard lines of causal relations. So what that causes is the general discourse to have a bias toward reducing people into fixed, defined groups. When I look at the metaphysical underpinnings of that behavior, because I think that sort of conceptual aspect informs the practical lived behavior. I think the primary question there, conceptual question there, is what is the self? Which is something I've always been interested in looking at from different ways, and I've been looking at it more from a philosophical perspective. And there's a lot of different ways to try and understand that. A lot of theories put out over the years, over the thousands of years of philosophy. Some people say the self is your body. Some people will say it's your brain. There's a argument about self being the consistency of memory as far back as you can remember. That's as far as your self extends. You could argue it's the narrative or the story that we tell ourselves. Some people might say you can only understand the self from an outsider perspective because that's less prone to bias. And then there are less Western perspectives on cognition, sort of like Buddhism, which argues that the self doesn't even exist in the first place. And these theories of mind, I think, are all interesting in the way that they have cultural impacts once they are examined and understood. I think examining those assumptions of what the self is changes our behavior, which is kind of what Socrates was trying to get at when he said the unexamined life is not worth living. That if your behaviors and beliefs are ruled by others, by social norms, rather than your own informed critical thought, that can lead to harm. So I'm of the belief that the self is more of a contextual, continual becoming, and that we are embedded in the world, meaning that we are not distinct from the world and other agents, which would be Cartesian subjectivism, if you want to look that up at home. But that in order to meaningfully understand the self, you have to include the world, because you can't understand those separated from each other. So our relationship with other objects and organisms and people is part of the self, and vice versa. And I think once you start breaking down those barriers, like the observer-observed dichotomy, and when you change that thinking that seems to be baked into everything we do, you have a profound implication for ethics and morality, which I believe are also part of politics. So if you look at something like Humean philosophy, or going back to Buddhist teachings, or there's a whole range of philosophy of mind theories. Like and this is not new for me to talk about on the show, but autopoietic enactivism was the first sort of theory that I really got into. But basically, they all serve to break down the barrier of the self and the other. And I think when you accept that that barrier is much more permeable or doesn't even exist, whether that's through reading philosophy or even just more practical experiences like expanding your friend group to people outside your station in life, as was brought up by Liz, it leads you to become, and you, more empathetic in your behavior towards others, because we realize how deeply intertwined our lives are with others. So the implication then is that if we aren't these closed off individual mechanistic systems, and we are, all of us, human, non-human, object, organism, the world, if we are the system, that means that we implicitly depend on and impact one another. And when you start thinking that way, it leads you to making decisions that reduce suffering for everyone, which in turn reduces suffering for yourself. And I think the core of that is to take a hard look at the impact our actions and beliefs have on others, and understand that acting in the best interest of the oppressed, which does often mean sacrificing temporary comfort, is synonymous with acting in our own best interests. And I pulled I tried to pare that down and make it make as much sense as I could. But I pulled a quote from when we're talking about the sort of this idea that there is not an objective pre-given world, and that we are all enacting the ontological becoming of what exists. I pulled this quote from Paulo just to throw in this, the jargon-filled, dense philosophy I love to read so much.
Yeah.
So here's a couple quotes. Organisms as sense-making creatures therefore bring forth their own unique worlds rather than find them pre-given. That moves ontology beyond the descriptive conceptual level into the realm of materiality and performative inaction. Here, objects and relations are studied empirically and understood to be social, historical, context-dependent, multi-agental enactments that vary over time and sometimes space. The focus thus shifts from the existence of being in the singular to the multiple process of open-ended becomings, enactments in the plural. So, and that concept goes all the way down to whatever you would think of as the foundations of existence on any level, up to like broader cultural experiences. All of the, I brought up a few different theories. They don't all necessarily agree with each other. And I think it's really interesting to read the nuances of, say, Buddhist philosophy versus Fourier philosophy, and to read about how semiosis is important to the process of understanding each other, and how like even down to the cellular level, we can see sense making through interpreting of the environment and symbols, and how that's an argument for the inextricable link between everything, and how everything is interacting and impacting each other. So all of those views don't necessarily agree with each other, but they do serve to break down that sort of, as you've talked about before, the what's prevalent in America, the rugged individual pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, separate and discrete from everything else. And so you don't have to go that far as I do, but I think breaking down those barriers is where we have to start, because a lot of bigotry stems from those reductionist, rationalist ways of viewing people.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing, and that's why it's important to make an argument for goth being political, is once you don't care, you end up perpetuating those systems that oppress women and people of color and queer people. And that gets reproduced, and people kind of pretend that that doesn't happen. We're goths, we're all weird, and it continues over time. And then you see people breaking off. And I've seen conversations in Black communities or Black goths talking about how they don't want to have to make sort of segregated spaces where we're Black goths and we're doing our own thing, but they also feel like sometimes they don't have any other choice, because people just pretend like nothing is going on. And I think that's really fucked up. And I think we have to address those things.
We do. I mean, I had a similar conversation. There's been a lot of conversations on Zachary's Facebook around, well, obviously, minority POC representation, not just within goth, but within the world. And there have been a few discussions around politics in goth. And I jumped into one, as one person was commenting on, these are all the reasons why goth can't be political. It's got these negative repercussions. And then, if you speak out, people can yell at you and say you're lying because you can't be that way. And they still go through preconceptions. So, just speaking out and having an opinion opens you up to being political, and thus being tarred by other people who are political. I found that to be a very flawed piece of reasoning.
I mean, you can say that about literally any opinion. It doesn't have to be political.
And the main thing from my perspective is, if you feel that by not speaking your mind, by not speaking your politics and your opinion, you are somehow beyond reproach and can't be critiqued because you didn't enter that arena, you're deluding yourself.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter whether you play the game or not. Anybody outside who looks at you will assume you play the game based on preconceptions. Who you hang out with, what you look like, what your job or activities or hobbies happen to be. Those will allow anybody who sees them and knows about them as you exist in the public sphere to make an assumption.
Yeah.
And if you do not say anything to disabuse them of that assumption, then it stands. There's no needing to think you're a liar. There's no cognitive work that needs to be done on their end. They can just coast on that assumption based on whatever stereotype they have about your kind of people. So, I was saying basically, if you're afraid that by speaking up, someone's going to be able to tar you as a racist because his example is kind of, if I speak up in a goth society about being anti-racist or anti-fascist or whatever, and someone has a preconception that goths are racist for some other reason, they're just going to assume I'm lying and think that Goths are racist.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't stand up and say you're against that,
Yeah.
they don't even have to think you're lying. They're just gonna think you're racist. They don't have to take that extra step. So it doesn't change anything to keep your head down. And even more so, since it's been mentioned many times that there are people in the community who do proclaim outright that goth is for white. Goth is, they don't say goth is racist, but goth is about white skin, because that's the makeup and the aesthetic and blah blah blah, Bela Lugosi and black and white movies and all that bullshit. If the only voice coming out of the goth community are these people who are willing to speak that misinformation, and the more moderates, the majorities who are not comfortable with politics, simply keep their head down, then goth is racist. That's just the perception of goth. That's just all it is, because that's the only message coming out of the community. And that's not acceptable.
Yeah. Even just from the perspective of trying to rationally think about concepts and have critical thought, as soon as someone accuses you, especially someone that's punching up, someone from a minority community accuses you of doing something hurtful to that community, your reaction should not be to defend what you said. Your reaction should be to say, please explain that to me. That's not my intent. I want to be better and I want to change. And it's just that kind of walling off behavior is a problem. And that's partly why we have to be vocal about these things, because otherwise that just continues.
Yeah, though I do think that, from the flip side, calling out people, especially using specific terms like mansplaining and some of those more charged languages, is a great way to just shut down conversations, for better or for worse, whether it's true or not. I don't necessarily think simply calling that out without any elaboration is really that helpful either.
But I
don't know a better way to do it, because it does need to be called out.
And
it is. Like, the internet is all about sound bites
but that's part of the thing.
Short clips.
You have to do as a person of privilege is to realize that the people who don't have that privilege are exhausted and sick of seeing that kind of thing all the time. And when you get accused of doing that thing, you need to back up and examine what you said and ask for guidance or apologize, or, and that happens a lot. I can't think of specific examples, but just stuff going on with people in charge or in power in various scenes, even if it's not like a big power position, but being accused of something and then immediately going on a tirade defending why that's incorrect, rather than saying it's time for me to listen and examine my actions, which is hard to do, but it's like one of the first things you learn in critical thinking and cognitive bias and fallacious reasoning is to be strong. What's the term? Strong manning other people's arguments.
Steel
manning, yeah. So that you have make that the most charitable version of that argument, and reflect on that, rather than trying to do the opposite and straw man it and just knock down an easy argument that didn't exist in the first place.
Right.
And so I don't know. It just bothers me.
Yeah, and there's other things around that where, when you're engaging in a discourse, when you're communicating with people, you have to realize that communication is two ways. It's not just what you say, it's also what the other person hears. And if you don't have a good understanding of both sides of the equation, you are not going to be able to effectively communicate. You're just shouting into the void at that point. So having those moments to stop and reflect, having the moment to say, all right, hold on. I said this, I intended this. That's great. I understand my side of the equation very well. This person said I'm mansplaining or expressing white privilege or some other thing that, as the person who is receiving that criticism can feel insulting, reductive, a symptom of quote unquote reverse discrimination, in that they're reducing me to my whatever pertinent, social aspect of, whether it's my color, my ethnicity, my social political place in society, all of that, you get that immediate response back. But by that same token, they obviously heard something that I said. And if I don't take the time to figure out what other people are hearing, I am not effectively talking either. So you need to do both. You need to be able to express your opinions and your ideas cogently, but also take the time to listen when people give you feedback so you can understand what the other person is hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I let you know what we will be talking about on our next episode and who our guest will be, I want to take some time to thank our Patreon members, without whom this episode and this podcast would not exist. Like I always mention, I am eternally grateful for our patrons allowing us the platform to have these conversations and to create such a unique Gothic parlor, if you will, in which Goths from all over the world, Goths with a local scene, with no scene, new and old, can find community and learn from each other. And I think that's something really special. At our founders level for July, we have Abigail, Cadaver Kelly, Esmeralda, Junkyard Bat, SJ, and Samantha. Our nocturnal council is Amy, DJ Azzy, Christine, Dawn, Felina, Fifth Dream, Hay Shaker, I Am Ruin, Jen, Carly, Michelle, Skullgirdle, Mike Mess, Moses, Natalie, Sav, Sebastian, Top Down Tom, and Jacob. And then at the Crow's Call level, we have Alana, Alex Kennedy, Anna, Anne, Ava, Becca, Bruce Lord, Captain Faust, Dagger Dance, David, Death Metal Kumbaya, Dom, Dry as She, Eduardo, Elizabeth, Enya, Esther, Eternal Winter, GPS, Gateway Goth Events, Gendalis, Heather, Irene, Isabel, JD, Isabel, Jan, Jason, Jean, Jen, Kay, Keen, Kelly, Kevin, King Rhinex, Kevin Murphy, Laura, Laurel, Lee, Lewis, Marissa, Martin, Megan, Morgan, Nia, Nick, Paul, Rebecca, Richard, Ryan, Sarah, Stuart, Susan, Stolas, Tasha, Two Broke Goths, Wicked Sin, Wolfie, Jonathan, Mark, Messy Toy Box, and The Ghost Pony. On September 2nd, we will return to our funeral diner, and we will be joined by guest Rose Nocturnalia. You may know her from YouTube. She produces fantastic content. I share it on the Facebook page all the time. And she's going to be joining us to talk about Gothic Lolita. That's a tangential subculture that we haven't discussed on this podcast, or at least certainly not with somebody that knows what they're talking about. So we're going to be covering all the basics, all the advanced stuff. We're going to be having a lovely conversation. Rose is a wonderful person, and I'm really excited to have her on. So until next time, stay dark.